Hello, I'm Yoxin. So today I think we kind of agree that China would not replace the United States to become a world supremacy, and it would not become the leader of the entire global community. But my question would be that could the panel comment on China being a leader or a role model for emerging economies and emerging countries in South America or African countries? Could we project this influence by giving them an alternative, saying that you could have a relatively stable and effective governing and then develop your economy before pushing social and economic changes? So I just wonder if the panel could comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, so we're back to the yes column, and I want to turn back to the panel to conclude and wrap up, but take a last round of questions. Are there other questions? We'll take them together. Yes, in the back there.
Hi, I'm a second-year DPhil student studying nuclear materials. I'm trying to ask a question about education. Nowadays, more and more Chinese students go to UK to study and get higher education. And China is making its efforts of getting us back to China to work for China. And I'm wondering, how do you think about that? Things you mentioned about intellectual soft power and Kimsey.
So you have a whole range of questions. I'd like to turn back to our panel and ask you to address them, perhaps starting with John.
Fine, thank you. I think my response comes less as a forecast of what position China will hold as a wish, as a hope. And I hope, as you can gather from my remarks, that China will be very much engaged in collective problem solving of the major world challenges, not of course just with the Brits, but I mean centrally placed in international affairs, contributing mightily to dealing with the enormous problems that face us all, because they lead to the survival or otherwise of the species at the end of the day. That's where I'd hope to see China. If I can link that with a couple of comments on what went before, just on the soft power raised by Guy initially. Very interesting. I see the undoubted effect, not just within the Chinese community, of China's overall success, but rising interest in visiting Chinese cultural activity. Throughout the British schools now, an active interest in studying Putonghua. As Asia House, we try and encourage interest in all the Asian languages. And I have to say, we have one success, which is encouraging Chinese, and a list of 15 or 20 failures. There is, in other words, Chinese language training has crossed a threshold now and is being taken up very actively as a survival skill, if you like, by British young people. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog the microphone, but there's a couple of thoughts.
Thank you.
Okay, if I could just follow on from that. I mean, like John, I would like to see the Chinese heavily involved in the resolution of various global collective problems that we face. But I believe that they will take incremental steps, that they will be cautious in the way they do it. And I would argue that again because of the political, social and economic problems that they face and that will absorb so much of their daily life. With respect to other points that have been made, I think I agree with Harry that the Chinese approach their foreign policy in a very pragmatic way. They are not ideological about it, but I think again this encourages this rather incrementalism in terms of their external actions. On the education point, yes, large numbers of Chinese are studying abroad, and I think that this is a very positive development. It's positive in the sense that many do wish to return home and make a contribution, and it's very positive that, unlike some other societies, the Chinese seem to embrace and absorb those that return, and to give them a place of responsibility and not perceive them as some kind of fifth column in some ways. In other words, that openness of China, of Chinese society, to external ideas and the ways in which these can be used to better the lives of Chinese, I think is something to be applauded and welcomed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just two of those questions. Is China's economic model a model for the world? The answer is, I think, no and yes. In many ways, the Chinese model is very similar to the model followed by all the tigers before it. Almost all of them grew rapidly under autocratic dictatorial regimes. The difference is that almost all of them have now become multi-party democracies. There is, if you go to India, a huge, look at envy of the way at which China mobilizes resources, gets behind things, builds railways, does all the things that India can't do. And they say democracy is a failure. No, it's not. It's that the Indian method of democracy and Indian management is a catastrophe. And I don't, to emulate the Chinese model, you'd have to turn back the clock to a different kind of regime when the whole trend has been in the opposite direction. China's place in the world, well, it's going to be a very different world. I mean, China is hugely dependent, in my view, on a global structure that's ceasing rapidly to exist. The multilateral system, which the curious thing about multilateral systems is they require, this one at any rate, required a hegemon to produce it and to maintain it. And the hegemon began losing interest about 40 years ago and has lost the capacity. And I think China is going to be, whether it likes it or not, is going to be compelled to become more involved because it just can't go on looking to the Americans to do all the heavy lifting for it, which is what it's been doing. I don't blame China for that. I think it's an entirely natural thing to do if you've got as many pressing challenges as the Chinese government has. But the fact is that in many cases, the worst thing that could happen from China's point of view is that the US would simply become isolationist and then go into meltdown. That would create huge problems for Beijing.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay.
Let me perhaps disagree a little bit with some of my colleagues. I do think Chinese soft power matters. As I argue with some colleagues in a forthcoming book, what we term illiberal state building is something which is, for all its potential flaws and its opportunities, increasingly popular in large parts of the developing world. The idea, indeed, that you can have a very sophisticated approach to foreign policy, an authoritarian state, and a very selective engagement with the global economy and a statist guidance of the economy is proving to be very popular in very important countries, for example, on the African continent. And as I tried to say in my discussion of Africa's international politics, the idea that African countries have to choose between a kind of Western model of democracy and a Chinese model is increasingly nonsensical. The truth is that in many ways we see a convergence, as I said, between a Western return to realpolitik and abandonment of some of the more utopian liberal democratic end-of-history pretenses of the 1990s and 2000s, and that we see a new emphasis which is above all on security, on politics and on business as opposed to on other things. So in that respect, the China model or China dream, however vague and inchoate and incoherent it may be, is exerting an extremely strong pull on the imagination of policymakers across the developing world. And I don't think it's something to be lazily dismissed as anachronistic. I think it is real, it is happening, and we'll see in the next 20 to 25 years where that might bring these countries or not.